Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Alura Looking Ahead webinar. This is the second webinar in our four-part series on poultry food safety, from farm to table. I am Cristina Mesa, and I have the privilege of serving as the Global Marketing Manager for Alura. Today, it's my pleasure to be your host and moderator. Before we kick things off, I'd like to inform you that this session will be recorded, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can post your questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible. Joining me today is Dr. Charles Hofacre. Dr. Hofacre currently serves dual roles of Director of Clinical Services, Department of Population Health, and Professor, Department of Avian Medicine, both within the College of Veterinary Medicine, University of Georgia. In addition, he serves as the President of the Southern Poultry Research Group. With over 2 decades of experience, he has made remarkable contributions to avian health, research, and education. Dr. Hofacre's extensive knowledge and leadership have led to the development of innovative programs and industry solutions, demonstrating his commitment to the field of avian medicine and animal health. Dr. Hofacre, thank you so much for joining us today, especially on your birthday. I'll pass the mic over to Dr. Hofacre. Dr. Hofacre, the stage is yours.
Thank you. And since it is my birthday, you can't ask me hard questions. You'll have to make it an easy question day. So after working with Salmonella and Campylobacter for almost 40 years, what I'll present to you is some of my clinical experiences of working with Salmonella primarily, and some with Campylobacter in trying to reduce those, but also some of the work that we've done in our research programs, both at the University of Georgia and here at Southern Poultry Research Group. One of the things that I would like for you to keep in mind is Salmonella and Campylobacter are normal bacteria in the intestine of a chicken.
Dr. Hofacre, sorry to interrupt you. We are not seeing your screen. Would you mind sharing it again, please?
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you so much, Dr. Hofacre.
Thank you. So Salmonella and Campylobacter are normal flora in the intestine of birds. This is work that Margie Lee and I did several years ago, looking at what is normal flora in a healthy chicken that's on a corn soy diet. And this gamma proteobacter down here, that's 1.3% of the normal flora, is where Salmonella and Campylobacter fall. So they're a very, very small portion of the bacteria in the intestine, and they don't cause the birds any problem. So we're trying to deal with two bacteria that cause people to be sick, but don't cause any problems for the chickens. So our goal in trying to understand Salmonella and Campylobacter is to understand how it moves from the farm to the processing plant. And we did a study in 2013. We did the study before that, but we published it in 2013, looking at what samples can we take on the farm that could correlate to what we see as number of Salmonella coming into the processing plant. We did that on 55 broiler flocks. And then we followed those flocks into the plant and took carcass rinses, feathers on carcass rinses. We did hot rehang, we did pre-chill rinse, and we did post-chill carcass rinses, trying to track everything all the way from the farm through the plant. So, and we made sure those were the first flocks that came into the plant so that we didn't have cross-contamination in the plant. So if we look at the amount of Salmonella, the number of flocks that had positive for Salmonella in this study, 91% of the farm samples were positive and 95% of the plant samples. So there's pretty good correlation with salmonella. But when we look at Campy coming into the plant, we had 64% positive on the farm for Campy and 87% once they come into the plant. So Campy is a different beast, and you'll understand why here in a moment. The type of samples that we took on the farm were boot socks, drag swabs, picking up fresh fecal samples, and litter samples composited throughout the house. On salmonella, you can see why we use boot socks. 68% were positive, whereas if you used a drag swab, 43, fecal samples, 14%, and litter samples, about the same as the fecal samples. Boot socks then are the best sample for us to take on the farm. For Campy, it looks like it doesn't matter. We just take a sample and we'll find Campy, except for litter samples. But when it comes to taking a sample that will tell us both for salmonella and for Campy, the boot sock looks like it's probably our best choice. And the reason is the numbers. The boot sock gives us a little over 2 logs. So the way you read these box plots, this is the mean, this is your range. So just a little over 2 logs on the boot socks, and everything else is much lower. So that's why boot socks tells us the best answers to what load is on our broiler farms coming into our plant. With Campy, look at the mean for Campy. Over 5 logs, almost 6 logs. And it's really high with just about every sample. So for Campy, it's much easier to find because it's there at much higher numbers. So those samples coming into the plant, and I know FSIS has talked about feathers on rinses as one of the measures for them and us to determine the load of salmonella coming into our processing plants. And that's what this outside plant is. These are 12 birds that we pulled right off of the live haul truck, euthanized, and did the rinse with the feathers on. And 46% were positive outside the plant. At rehang, hot rehang, it's down to 43, and pre-chill 18. Post-chill is 2%. So we can see with salmonella, the numbers go down in the plant like we would expect. With Campy, though, almost 70% of those feathers on rinses are positive, and it comes down, but not nearly as much as we see with salmonella. And again, the reason that Campy doesn't come down as significantly is the load of Campy coming into the plant is so much higher than it is for salmonella. This tells us that the mean of feathers on rinses is a little less than 1 log, with some birds having almost 5 logs. But with Campy, you've got birds that are over almost 9 logs of Campy. So Campy numbers, if FSIS begins to regulate Campy, this is going to be our struggle, because the numbers of Campy in a bird's intestine and birds shedding in the farm and shedding onto themselves with the feathers on coming into the plant is much higher than with salmonella. The other thing to realize, and we don't understand why, but if you look at these outside the plant samples, each of these dots is, so this says that there are 4 flocks that we tested of the 55, that 100% of the birds of the 12, so 12 out of 12 were positive for salmonella. Or down here, there's 6 flocks that when one was negative, they were all negative for salmonella. But if you look at Campy, if one bird is positive, almost all the birds are positive. If one bird is negative, almost all the birds are negative. There's not a uniform distribution. So Campy, they're either really positive or they're really negative, which is much different from salmonella. The campy that causes human foodborne illness is almost entirely, probably 85 or 90% of what CDC finds in foodborne outbreaks with campy are campy jejuni. And if we look at the distribution of the different campies we found on these 55 flocks, 88% of the flocks are positive for campy jejuni. So the bulk of the campy that we have on broiler farms are campy jejuni, which is the primary campy that causes human foodborne illness. One of the big questions we have is, well, what sample should I take on the farm to help me predict the load or the amount of salmonella coming into the plant? And this is one of the big questions that FSIS has is, can we do things that measure the amount of salmonella and campy coming into a plant? So these outside the plant are those feathers on rinses and boot socks. And this is campy. You can see there's a pretty nice correlation between boot socks and the load of campy coming into the plant. So boot socks are probably a good predictor for us of load for campy. And salmonella. Not as strong a correlation with salmonella with boot socks to the load coming into the plant, but they do give us a good correlation. So for us to measure how much campy and salmonella we have on a farm coming into the plant, boot socks will probably be our best sample. So let's talk about what we can do to reduce salmonella coming into the farm, coming from the farm or onto our farms. Rather than trying to deal with it in every potential source, let's think about what comes into our farms. And let's first start with breeders, because breeders are our primary source of salmonella coming downstream from the hen through the egg to the broiler and onto our broiler farms. What things do we bring onto the breeder farms? What things do we bring into our broiler farms that we can reduce salmonella load? We know that flies are a source of salmonella and campy. I mean, since we were little children, if we were on a picnic with our parents and a fly landed on our food, your mother shooed the fly away to keep germs. So we've known for decades that flies can be a source of moving salmonella and campy from farm to farm. The other that we know is rodents. We know that rats and mice can carry campy and salmonella in their intestinal tract. And that's not something hard for us to understand. What is more difficult is, if we're going to be successful in reducing rodents and reducing the risk that they can bring salmonella to our farms, we have to understand which ones we have. And it's not going to be complex wide. It's going to be farm by farm. So the example is the roof rat. The roof rat is arboreal. It lives in trees. It's going to get into the ceiling and the attic space of our farms, both broiler and breeder farms. If we put bait stations all around the perimeter on the outside of our broiler farm or along on the slats area, we won't be successful, because they live in the attic. They come down the wires that suspend the feeders and waters and nest boxes, and they go right back up. So they're not going to be in an area where we have bait boxes. So we're going to have to bait them up in that attic area. Whereas the mouse and the Norway rat lives outside and comes in, and the mouse will be every 30 feet is their territory. So what rodents we have determines how we will bait and where we will bait. And that's going to be very farm specific. really good example is this work that Kate Hayes did when she was working on her master's, where she had bait boxes around the perimeter and she measured the rodent numbers. And what Kate found was that as we got toward the fall and winter, the number of rodent activity increased through the fall, winter, and then it went back down in the late winter, spring. The next year it came back up again in the fall and winter and back down. So why does that happen? Well, most of this activity was mice, and most of them were wanting to find a nice warm place to spend the winter. Well, what does this have to do with salmonella? Kate also swabbed those boxes, and what she found was that in the fall, in winter, the number of salmonella isolated out of those bait boxes increased and it went down. The next year, it went back up in the fall and winter and back down. So we know that those mice are our source of salmonella risk to come into our broiler houses and our breeder houses. Beetles are also a significant risk, and I'll show you some additional work on Campy that Elizabeth Dale did for her master's. At the University of Arkansas, they did a really nice study looking at how long can salmonella live inside of a beetle. And what they found is that if they allowed beetles to feed on Salmonella typhimurium infected feed, that it would live for 2 months, 60 days within the intestines of those beetles. And so we have a 4-week downtime, let's say, which most people don't have that long. But that's still, those beetles, if they're in that broiler house, they're still going to carry whatever salmonella was there to the next flock, even with a 4-week downtime. And as gizzard on the right side is a turkey poult full of ground up beetles. So they're going to eat the beetles. So Elizabeth's project was to look at, could we do all of these things that the experts say we should do for Campylobacter to reduce it by biosecurity? And this resulted from the opportunity that I had to be on an expert panel for the World Health Organization on Campy. And we found a broiler farm and a cooperating integrator who let us do on that broiler farm everything that the European Union and everything that this expert panel suggested we do for Campy. And we did that on 3 broiler flocks. We had the step over barrier where the grower came in, they sat on a bench and they changed shoes, and then they went into that broiler house. They alcohol gelled their hands. We cleaned and disinfected. We had heat treated litter that had gone through a kiln. We did everything we could possibly do for rodents, beetles, flies, and disinfecting, formaldehyde fumigation. The first flock was our baseline before we did all of this. Then we did all of that. In the second flock, they went positive within the second week for salmonella and Campy. And we were really frustrated. We thought, how did that happen? So we did it again, all of those things again on the same broiler farm. And this time, instead of the second week, they went positive on the 3rd week in the first house and positive by the 4th week on the second house. So we delayed it, but they still went positive. So we were pretty frustrated. If you want all the details, Elizabeth published this in the journal Applied Poultry Research. The other thing on salmonella is it had the exact same thing. We delayed it from going positive in the first week to the second week, but we didn't make it go away. So why? One of the other things that Elizabeth did was to catch and count beetles. And what we found was that the beetle numbers began to come up in that second and third week in that third flock And when she cultured them in house 1, they were 70% positive for Campy and 100% positive in house 2. So the beetles were probably what was frustrating us through all of that disinfection and all that cleaning and everything that we did. And even though we did everything we could to control beetles, it's pretty tough in southeastern United States to eliminate darkling beetles. And they were carrying it over from flock to flock. We never isolated it out of any of the flies that we caught either. All right, so cleaning and disinfecting. This looks like a do this first, do that second, do all of these things for cleaning and disinfecting your broiler farm. And what I'm saying is, I don't know that we have to do all these things, but I want us to think about the order in which we do things that we do clean and disinfect. Why would you want to bait for rodents first? So you have a hen farm, you're going to clean out, you're going to take out the slats and clean out the litter. Well, if there's mice in that hen farm and you move the slats and the litter, where do they go? They run away. They go out into the outside the barn, come back in when we bring in the slats and litter and bring the birds in. So we've done nothing to get rid of the rodents. What we want to do is bait the rodents while they're still accustomed to coming into that house or living in that house, so we can kill them before they go out. And why would we want to use our insecticide last? Because those beetles migrate into the wall or migrate outside of the chicken house, and they come back in when it warms back up. So we want that insecticide to be as a barrier if they come back in, so we can kill them as they come through to come back into the house. So not just a recipe, but think about the logic of how we clean and disinfect. One of the questions I get all the time is, can drinking water be a source of salmonella or Campy? And yes, it can. As the source of water from the well, not very often in the 40 years I've been doing this. I think maybe once or twice I've seen where a well has been contaminated by runoff around the wellhead. Most of the time it's not the well. But even though we have nipple drinkers, water gets backward up into that water line. And salmonella and Campy produce biofilms that protect it. Even if we have disinfectant in between flocks, we run chlorine. So it's important that we use chlorine and use a disinfectant in our water lines when we're cleaning out, so we can kill that biofilm and kill the location for the salmonella and Campy to live. Litter can also be a source. Ed Mallinson, University of Maryland, did some really nice work looking at the water activity level in the litter. And as the moisture level in the litter goes up, you'll find more salmonella and campylobacter in that litter, because it needs the moisture to live and survive. So keeping our broiler houses dry is important for us in controlling salmonella and campylobacter, as it is for many other things. Also, use of the different types of products that can lower the pH in the litter is important. Salmonella and Campy like a higher pH, that alkaline environment. If we can keep it down below 5 or below 4 even, then salmonella and Campy can't grow and reproduce. So this is the list of all of the things that this expert panel for World Health Organization put out and said, hey, you need to do this if you want to control Campy on the farm. And these are all great steps for us for both salmonella and Campy, and for most disease control. Unfortunately, there are a lot of these things, you can make some of them work in a research setting, but we have yet to find any on Campy that consistently works in the real world. There's some vaccine programs that are coming. These bacterial viruses, these bacteriophages, bacteriocins are chemicals that bacteria produce to inhibit the growth of other bacteria and competitive exclusion. We're going to have interventions for CAMPI. I hope we have some of these interventions that work consistently by the time FSIS does get around to implementing CAMPI regulations. But right now, we don't have any that consistently works. If we look at some of the interventions that I've used in the years that I've been working with salmonella and dealing with trying to lower salmonella, my experience has shown that not any one intervention works all the time. And if we have too high of a level of salmonella, it's going to be much more difficult to get that level down. And if we have a flock that's salmonella positive, say we have salmonella enteritidis in a broiler flock, once it's positive, we're not going to make it go completely away. Our goal is going to be to lower the level so that it's a lower load coming into the plant. And the plant then can deal with it and hopefully eliminate it so that we don't have anybody getting sick. So some of the interventions that I've used are vaccination, both live and killed, competitive exclusion, both defined and undefined. So probiotics that we are direct fed microbials that are defined, or the undefined products like the Avigard product or the Broilact product. Water treatments. I have used antibiotics in the past in breeding programs, immune modulators, and then the biggest thing are combinations. And I'll touch on some of these briefly for you, just as an example. So direct-fed microbials or competitive exclusion. This is a Bacillus licheniformis probiotic that was in the feed. What we wanted to know was, if we have one of these probiotics in the feed, can it help us with salmonella? And this was a salmonella Heidelberg challenge. And also for our coccidia control, we use an ionophore and BMD, bacitracin, in these broilers. And what we saw was we got a significant reduction of salmonella Heidelberg colonization using this bacillus in the feed. So it was inhibiting the growth of the salmonella. We had a numerical reduction, but not significant, by having better toxic control as well. Arthur Hinton at the Russell Research, USDA, ARS here in Athens, in some early work, looked at combinations. And this is something I hope sticks in your head, that we can't expect one thing to work for salmonella. Arthur looked at an organic acid, formic acid, in the feed. He looked at a competitive exclusion. This was an undefined. And he looked at a combination of the acid and the competitive exclusion. And each one lowered the salmonella enteritidis load, but the combination worked better than the two by themselves. So keep in mind, when we're looking at salmonella reduction, we need to think about not just finding that one silver bullet, but finding maybe a combination of silver bullets that'll help lower the level. I've used live salmonella vaccination in broilers as one of my go-tos. And this is why. This was a pen study that we did here at SBRG, and we vaccinated these broilers a day of age with a spray of a live salmonella vaccine. And then we boosted them at 14 days in the drinking water. When they were 4 days old, we challenged half of the birds in each pen with salmonella Heidelberg. And then we measured the level of salmonella, both prevalence and number, at 42 days. So what we saw was that the vaccine, we had no positive pens. And in those pens that we didn't have the salmonella vaccine, we had as high as 90% of the birds in the pen positive for salmonella Heidelberg. So the salmonella vaccine worked very well, preventing those cedar birds, those half of the birds in each pen, from spreading it to their pen mates. And it kept, since we didn't find any salmonella, we couldn't count any. It also, rather than having 2 logs of salmonella in the Zika, we had 0. So the live salmonella vaccine can be very effective at reducing the prevalence and the number of salmonella in the Zika of birds. So when I had presented this at a meeting, one of the broiler companies came to me and said, "Hey, I'd like to try to do a field study. Can we reproduce what you saw in that floor pen study?" I said, "Okay, let's do that." So we measured the amount of salmonella in the Zika of their broilers for 4 weeks. What we did was, as the service techs were going to the farm to collect fat pads or pesticide residue, we had them pull the Zika out of those birds that they euthanized. And that was at 28 days before they were going to the plant. So we did that for the first 4 weeks. Then they began to vaccinate at a day of age and boosted it 14 days, just like we did in that study. And we were really frustrated. We thought, wow, didn't work. The numbers of salmonella pre-study and post-study, it didn't change. We still had over a log in those Zika. We were pretty frustrated. But then when we started looking at which salmonellas, what we found was Salmonella group D, which was Salmonella enteritidis. Pre-study, we had 16%, almost 17% of the Zika were positive for SE. After, we had 3%. We had a significant reduction in those bad guys. What we didn't change was the Salmonella Kentucky, C2, C3. And that's why our numbers and the prevalence didn't change, because the salmonella vaccines don't work very well against Kentucky. But they do work really well against Salmonella enteritidis. So again, the vaccines aren't a silver bullet. They're not going to do everything, but they are a big part of our control program. So remember, Salmonella and Campi are normal flora within the gut of a chicken. We're trying to eliminate normal bacteria that don't bother the chicken at all, or the turkey. And so that's why it's so difficult for us. One of the other questions I get a lot is, as we shifted toward antibiotic free and less use of antibiotics and less use of ionophores, are we at greater risk of salmonella on an antibiotic free program? And so we've done some studies looking at using an AGP, an ionophore, and a direct fed microbial, and different ionophores, just to try to understand what all of these different gut health things might be impacting. And what we can see is cocci control can have a significant impact on salmonella colonization. So how we choose to control cocci in an antibiotic-free program can have an impact on us for salmonella control as well. And in that same study, it decreased the numbers of salmonella in the Zika of those birds. So keep in mind that we may not have as direct an impact going antibiotic free, or how we choose to control coccidia on salmonella load and salmonella prevalence coming into our plants. It's more of an indirect on cocci control one of the things that Scott Russell, before he passed away, found was that bird size can have an impact on Salmonella and Campi in the plant. A lot of the things that we'll do on an antibiotic-free program can also have an impact on our Salmonella and Campi control programs, maybe not directly on the Clostridium, but indirectly on giving Salmonella the opportunity to grow and proliferate. So remember, what we do on the live side for Salmonella control is to try to reduce the numbers. We're not going to make Salmonella go away. We won't eradicate Salmonella. There's 2,500 or more different kinds of Salmonella out there, cerevars. We're not going to make them all go away. What we want to do is look at combinations of interventions that can help us lower the load, lower the numbers from our breeders to our hatchery to our broilers, so that the numbers are less coming into the processing plant. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hofacre, for your enlightening presentation. We've been receiving some interesting questions on our chatbot, and we'll start with our first one. So the first question is, would interventions, feed additives that reduce Salmonella shed in the litter reduce the increase of incidence, severity of infection, and ultimately incoming load of the plant?
Well, there's been quite a few studies that have been done on litter amendments. And as I mentioned, though, right now, what we primarily use are litter amendments that will lower the pH of the litter so that the Salmonella and Campi can't survive and grow at that low pH. But there's also some really interesting products that people are looking at that are direct fed microbials that pass through the bird that can have an effect on the ability of Salmonella and Campi to live in the litter. So, litter interventions and things that we do to dry the litter and to lower the pH, all those things that we know that help make litter a good environment for the birds to be on will also help us lower Salmonella.
Thank you so much. We have another question here. Are darkling beetles the only thing that helps Campylobacter to spread so quickly through the flock?
No, the darkling beetles, I think, what we found is that, and I'll back up. So the European Union, most companies in Europe have found that flies are probably their biggest source of Campi being spread. In the US, we found that flies probably are not, but that is probably the beetle. And it's not so much that the beetle spreads it within the flock, but I think it's the beetle that maintains it from one flock to the next, even with a good cleaning and disinfecting program. So, we've looked at drinking water and Campi's survival in the drinking water, and it will survive from one flock to the next in that biofilm. So it's not just the beetles, but there's a lot of other sources besides the beetle. I think the beetle is one that's a very difficult one for us, especially in southeastern US, where it's hot and humid, and it's a good climate for the beetle to survive.
Thank you. We have another one here. Which is more concerning, the ability to reduce Salmonella or Campi incoming loads?
Right now in the US, FSIS is looking at ways to measure the incoming load of Salmonella. They're not as concerned about Campi. They will eventually become more concerned because the European Union is is, and especially the UK, highly regulating Campy on broilers. And Campy is the #1 cause of bacterial foodborne illness in people in the US. It doesn't make people as sick as salmonella, and there's not as much risk for people to get so sick that they die from Campy as with salmonella. And so it's not as much pressure, but I think eventually Campy will be regulated. But right now it's salmonella incoming load that FSIS is worrying about.
Thank you, Dr. Hofacre. We have a couple more questions we try to address as much as possible. If boot socks load are the best repeatable measure of incoming salmonella and Campy, how many boot socks should be collected by house or farm prior harvest?
Yeah, and that's a good question. How many boot socks? And I think what everyone will need to do is do a small study, just like I presented to you that we did on those 55 flocks within your complex, because it may be different depending on where you are within the country, you know, what type of houses you have, what litter you use, if you use rice hulls or peanut hulls or pine shavings or straw. But by and large, it's probably going to be one pair. You put one pair, put a boot sock on your right foot and a boot sock on your left foot and walk the house. And where you want to walk is between the feeders, the feed line and the water line, because we found that you can walk the same house out along the perimeter of the house and not find salmonella, but if you walk between the feed and water lines, you will. And I think that has to do with that moisture level within the litter. So probably one pair, 2 boot socks, 1 on each foot will be what most everyone will find.
Thank you. We have 1 more minute so we could go over another question. In your opinion, which of the field interventions will yield the best on-farm Campylobacter reductions? Litter acidification, darkling beetle, and rodent control, feed additives, or live vaccines?
For Campylobacter, we don't have anything that I can consistently say will work. For salmonella, I can give you all types of products and combinations that I would use, and I have used in many different situations. But with Campy, I'm afraid we don't have any one vaccine that consistently works, or direct fed microbial, or litter amendment. I think the load, as we showed, the number of Campy are so high that it is much more difficult to deal with than salmonella. So there's a lot of research. A lot of the work that I do here at Southern Poultry Research Group is looking for interventions that we can use for Campy control. So I would be watching for future interventions, but right now we don't have anything that consistently works.
Thank you. We have 1 more question, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Can you give your experience with litter reuse? It's withdrawing effective for salmonella reduction. Is it worth the leaf operation expense, farm downtime?
So if I understand it correctly, does windrowing and downtime have a value for salmonella control? And without a doubt, both of those are important. I can't quantify downtime for you for salmonella control because salmonella will survive a long period of time in dust. There was a researcher in the UK who took a dust sample from a broiler farm, put it in a bottle and set it on a shelf in his lab, and every so often for over a year would take samples out and it would still be alive. But to to have downtime is important for some of the viral diseases, and it's also important for us to be able to maintain the litter and do that windrowing. Windrowing and doing it properly is very effective at reducing Salmonella, Campi, and some of the other viral diseases. So yeah, definitely do windrowing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hofacre. We have another bit of questions, but I think we are running out of time. We'll try to address them later on for all the ones that made the question. Once again, a big thank you to Dr. Hofacre for sharing your invaluable insights with us today. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to all the attendees for joining us in this webinar and to our dedicated colleagues behind the scenes who worked really hard to make this event possible. Before you depart from this webinar, we kindly request a moment of your time to participate in the survey that we're going to be sending further on and a follow-up email. Your feedback is incredibly important and it helps us to continually improve our webinars. Also, don't hesitate to reach out with any feedback or questions. Remember, this is just the beginning of our 4-part webinar session. Our next session is scheduled for January 10th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time with Dr. Marcos Sanchez, and he will be enlightening us with microbiology mapping. We look forward to having you join us again. Wishing you a wonderful day. Thank you very much, and goodbye for now. Thank you, Dr. Hofacre.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.